Hi guys, welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for today's lecture we're going to begin a two-part look at emancipation. Now, before we begin our look at emancipation, I'd like to do a customary recap and just touch bases on where we left off in our last series of lectures. In our last lecture, we looked at the campaigns between September of 1862 and the fall of 1863. In particular, we looked at the battles of Antietam, Gettysburg, and Vicksburg, and we saw how they sort of swung the momentum. Also, Chancellorsville. We also looked at Chancellorsville. We saw how they sort of swung the momentum back and forth between the United States and the Confederate States. We also saw how Gettysburg was not seen as a great victory. Antietam was a tactical stalemate, made only relevant because of the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, while Vicksburg and Chancellorsville were unequivocal victories, but for both sides. Both sides are jockeying for position in the war, but not really able to deliver a death blow or to score multiple decisive victories against their opponents. Uncontested and in a string, multiple victories over their opponents. And lastly, we saw that the gaze of the United States and the Confederate States, they were narrowing onto two particular commanders. Ulysses S. Grant for the United States, who was the top commander in the West, and Robert E. Lee, the top commander in the East for the Confederate States. And now, with that being said, let's dive right into the background of emancipation. Now, have we discussed in our previous lectures on the spread of the rebellion and the movement for succession, slavery was the taproot of the war. Secession was a reaction to Lincoln's election in 1860, his victory in the 1860 presidential election. The United States went to war to preserve the Republic, however. That was the unifying cry that spurred many to enlist. Those 75,000 volunteers, they did so not to suppress slavery, but to suppress the rebellion. Early on, however, fissures began to emerge regarding what type of republic there would be after the war. A republic with slavery or a republic without slavery? Would there be an all-out war with the slave states being remade into the image of the free states? Or a limited war that brought about mediation and compromise between the two belligerent factions? This is exemplified by the Northern generals who, after achieving a victory, allowed the Confederate armies to retreat. They wanted to beat them and prove that they could not succeed, but they did not want to destroy their army, destroy their war-making capabilities, so that they could not be able to bargain when an armistice was eventually reached. Lincoln was an opponent to the practice of slaveholding. He was against slavery, but he was not willing to jeopardize the Republic or the Republic's war effort over slavery, or even alienate the pro-slavery elements in the United States vis-a-vis the Democrats, the 19th century Democratic Party. The United States, after all, had gone to war for the Confederate States. The beginning argument for the war against the Confederate States was that secession was illegal. Now, slavery was legal under the Constitution. The Constitution gave the United States the right to, gave the individual states the right to govern domestic institutions, and slavery qualified as a domestic institution, meaning that eliminating slavery was not just something the president could do. The border states also factored into Lincoln's decision to tread lightly over slavery. He, along with Congress, did not want to antagonize them into joining the Confederate States. In addition to the free states, and in addition to this, the free states were themselves divided over emancipation. Now, within Lincoln's own party, there were three main divisions. First, there were the conservatives who disliked slavery but were gradualists. And a gradualist had applied to emancipation or abolition was someone who favored action by the individual states and wanted emancipation to be followed by recolonization or a mass movement of African Americans abroad after emancipation. Next, there were the moderates, and they were the majority in the Republican Party. They wanted to end slavery sooner than the conservatives, but they were always checked, or they were always on guard against social upheaval. They feared that social upheaval would ensue if emancipation was done too soon. They agreed with the conservatives early on, proceeding slowly and even championing recolonization for freed slaves. And last, there were the radical Republicans, the radicals, who gained momentum as the war went on, and many of the moderates, in fact, drifted toward their position on emancipation. They wanted abolition immediately. They wanted freedom to be a war aim from the beginning. They advocated using the war power clauses of the president to strike at slavery. They held key posts in Congress. For example, Charles Sumner, the same Charles Sumner who was caned by Preston Brooks in the infamous caning incident in the Senate. Charles Sumner, a Massachusetts senator, called for emancipation immediately after the war began, arguing that the slave states lost all of their constitutional protections when they succeeded. Now, Sumner chaired the Foreign Affairs Committee in Congress, in the Senate. Henry Wilson, also of Massachusetts, chaired the Committee on Military Affairs. John P. Hale of New Hampshire was in charge of the naval affairs. He was in charge of naval affairs. Zachariah Chandler chaired the Committee on Commerce. Ben Franklin Wade of Ohio was a firebrand reformer. He championed abolition and labor reform. He was noted for actually seeking confrontation with slave owners. But Ben Franklin Wade was also deeply racist towards African Americans, and he chaired the Committee on Territories in the Senate. Now, to balance them all out, you have perhaps the most influential, if not the most hated, radical Republican, Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania. Thaddeus Stevens chaired the powerful Committee on Ways and Means, and Stevens was the most radical of them all. He grew up poor, suffered from a club foot, championed the weak, and those who were at a decisive, a considerable societal disadvantage. He gave open-handedly to charities. He hated the slavocrats and wanted them to be punished severely. And also, an interesting sort of side note with Stevens was that Stevens never married. He ended up taking into his care two of his nephews, and providing for them. But he also provided for his African-American longtime maid. There's a great controversy surrounding it. Many people believe that they were in a common law marriage, that Stevens maintained this long-term relationship with her. He provided for her sons. He saw that the boys received a good education, and he provided for them all in his will. As a matter of fact, his will stipulated that his housekeeper was to have use of his house until she died. A great controversy surrounds it. Many people hated Stevens because of that. They made the comparison of Thaddeus Stevens and his maid with Thomas Jefferson and his slave Sally Hemings. But there's no letters or anything like that really survives to indicate one way or another whether Stevens actually indeed had this relationship with his housekeeper. But off of that, and back onto the radical Republicans, they wielded power completely disproportional to their actual size. Now, because I just listed them as being the chairs of these committees, you would think that they held a considerable numerical advantage in both houses of Congress, and that was not the case. They were a minority within the Republican Party. They were a minority within Congress. There were more Democrats than there were radical Republicans. But they chaired the most important committees of the war: territories, ways and means, military affairs, naval affairs. They chaired foreign affairs. They chaired the most important ones, and they were unabashed in their views on the war and pushing towards abolition. Now, the Democrats, for their part, were willing to fight for the Republic, but not for emancipation. There was an almost universal opposition to emancipation among the Democrats. They were strongest among the Irish community, the Irish Catholic community, and the lower counties of the lower tier of free states. The Little Egypt area, the Butternut counties, all those areas. They were strongest there. They did not want to compete with black laborers. Many of the Democratic supporters were low-wage earners, and they feared an influx of black laborer providing even cheaper labor, competing for them for their industrial jobs. Virtually all the African American population at this point lived in the slave states. They feared that freedmen and women would flood into the free states and the territories, and miscegenation. That is, racial mixing would ensue. There was a very strong strain of racism, I must say, in the free states. There was a very strong strain of racism throughout the 19th century in the United States, in the slave states, in the territories, and in the free states. These sentiments went way beyond just the slave antipathy for the slaves or opposition to emancipation. Most of the soldiers only enlisted to preserve the Republic, not to free the slaves. Most accepted emancipation to defeat the Confederate states. In the end, the dual threats of economic competition and racial mixing brought out the worst in the United States and really made moves towards emancipation highly problematic. Now, recolonization. Recolonization was also a solution that applied to many in the United States. It seemed to be an easy solution to the problem, and that is that the idea behind recolonization meant that you would avert the worst fears of those who worried about economic competition, ethnic violence, and racial amalgamation in areas where former slaves and slave owners lived, and then also in the free states. Lincoln tried to drum up support for this plan among free men at a White House, free African American men at a White House meeting. The first time that the president had met with African Americans, had invited guests to the White House in August of 1862. These men flat out refused when Lincoln pitched his plan for recolonization. They reminded Lincoln that this was their home too. They refused to support recolonization. Robert Purvis, who was a wealthy African American abolitionist, wrote an open letter to Lincoln, and I'll give you a quote of it. It is in vain you talk to me of two races and their mutual antagonism in the matter of rights. There is but one race, and that is the human race. Sir, this is our country, as much as this is yours, and we will not leave it. Frederick Douglass, the most famous, the most known, the most prominent African American of the 19th century, was upset after hearing what Lincoln had proposed, and he put things more directly. He said that it showed all of Lincoln's inconsistencies and its pride of race and blood, and its contempt for Negroes. Very, very harsh words in the 19th century, and it still stings now in the 21st century, but especially harsh in the 19th century to be lobbed at the president. But Lincoln was becoming used to being the target of political jabs and political assaults. He pushed forward with a plan for recolonization. That brings us to Ile à Vache, or Cow's Island. Now, Lincoln held to recolonization, and he mounted an expedition during the Civil War, during the United States Civil War, as a test, as really a test experiment, a trial. 500 freedmen and women were sent to Ile à Vache, Cow's Island, under the supervision of Bernard Koch, a speculator and cotton factor who promised to establish schools, hospitals, ensure that these communities were given all the agricultural tools they needed to grow, maintain, and then export cash crops for cash payments. He promised all of these things. When the settlers arrived, there were no schools, no hospitals, no nothing. They were abandoned and left to their own devices, and disaster soon followed. Disease swept through, smallpox in particular swept through, and the entire thing had to be called off. When news of the calamity reached Lincoln in Washington, he immediately dispatched ships to bring those people back to the United States, but less than 375 people survived. And then that was the end of presidential recolonization talks. Lincoln moved on from it after this tremendous loss of life, after this horrific defeat of his experiment. But it did not end talks of recolonization. And even now, people still bring up the idea of repatriating the African American community out of the United States. It's one of those things that never really went away. Now, invariably, with the talks of emancipation, we tend to view emancipation in these terms. Lincoln freed the slaves. Lincoln is the great emancipator. Congress, through its legislative acts and the United States commanders in the field, another view, aside from the Lincoln at the great emancipator, another view is that Congress, through its legislative acts, and the United States commanders in the field, who took the promise of freedom into the South, had as much to do with emancipation as Lincoln did. Now, none of these arguments touch on the thousands of slaves who seized their own destinies and self-emancipated themselves by fleeing their plantations, farms, workshops, and other business places they were being held. It's remarkable that only within the past couple of decades has the narrative on emancipation widened. African American participation was limited to Frederick Douglass and other notables pushing and edging white allies to act, pushing Lincoln to act, pushing Lincoln to do more, pushing Congress to do more, pushing field commanders and treating all these people to do more. The fact that these people had to act because slaves took it upon themselves to self-emancipate and create a situation in which those other three elements, the field commanders, the sitting Congress, and the sitting president, had to act to reach some sort of settlement, to issue some sort of settlement. That fact has really been overlooked. It's only now being examined. It was the growing number of runaways who were termed contrabands of war that confronted the United States with the problem of what to do with them. Whether or not they were still slaves became a very pressing issue. About 1 in 7 slaves made their way to the United States Army lines. Many scholars now posit the question, and that is posed the question, of how did how did the slaves do so much to free themselves? That's a new question. That's something that had never really been asked before in United States history, and it's or even amongst historians. It's something that is gaining traction. We were actually at this point we're talking less about whether Congress, the generals, or Lincoln freed the slaves, and we're looking at the role that slaves who had long been marginalized, how much of a role they really play. But we're looking at a fuller picture in which these elements all came together to make emancipation a proclamation, make emancipation an aim. In the United States, only the abolitionists and the radical Republicans, who were often one and the same, called for emancipation to be a war aim. Frederick Douglass opined early in the war, no matter what most Northerners chose to think the war was really about, the war was really a war for and against slavery. Wendell Phillips told Confederates, whenever you tread outside, and Wendell Phillips again is a Republican politician, he told them that whenever you tread outside of the Constitution, the black man is not 3/5 of a man. He is a whole man. That is a very powerful statement to be said at that time, and especially a very powerful statement to be aimed at the Confederate States. Now, the abolitionists argued that attacking slavery and abolishing slavery were war necessities, and they used this to rally others who were otherwise indifferent to emancipation. And it is at this point we'll break in our lecture on emancipation, and we'll come back in our part 2 of this lecture to wrap up our thoughts and our feelings on emancipation. As always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture on emancipation.